Hit my record button. Welcome. Today is week 4, day 3 of the Mern stack. And I wanted to talk about something a little bit off script. It's not necessarily anything on the platform. It's just something that I've been exposed to. And as somebody who does not have a computer science background and is mostly self-taught, learning about project management helped me understand a lot about what my role is in a larger company and feel kind of confident in my own self-study. Like, am I able to study things that get me better at a job and increase my opportunities to get even more interesting work? So to kick all of this off, I wanted to talk about a style of project management or an example of project management, how it used to be, maybe kind of gone wrong. So we're going to kick this off with a brief conversation about waterfall project management. And I think the best way to kind of show both agile and waterfall is to kind of just compare the two in a theoretical situation. So my theoretical situation is that I need to build this application. A customer comes to me and they want me and my software engineering team, say all of you, to build this application. And he hands me this massive design document, which is about like 100 pages of this. Dry, colorless text descriptions of the functionality and the requirements and the scope and the needs and everything that this person wants for their application. They have this 100-page design document, all right? And they take this 100-page design document and they give it over to us and they say, okay, first off, can you build this? Second off, how long is it going to take? Now, I have, looking at this stack of paper, absolutely no way to actually accurately predict how long it's going to take to build it. I can guess, but it would just be a guess. It would be totally random. We have no way of predicting. We haven't done any amount of checking of this application at all. I'm just being handed a stack of directions and I'm accepting it. All right, so we take this and we go through and we're going to build our application. And the plan is we're going to go through all of the requirements on this document and understand them. All right, we're going to understand what the requirements are for this particular piece of software. And once we've kind of captured the scope of everything that we're going to build here, we're going to go on to system design. All right, system design is where we start thinking about how this is actually built. This is talking about things like what our database looks like, what technologies we're going to use, um, uh, what certain naming conventions are. It's kind of building a blueprint of what we want to do, possibly even including a wireframe at this point. All right. And then once all of that is done, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, I could just arbitrarily be putting week markers on these. Maybe this will take us 1 month, and maybe this will take us 1 month, and maybe this will take us uh, 1 month for design, and that's verifying that everything works. And then we have verification and test where we have to implement everything. I think actually design implementation is going to take a lot longer. Let's say it takes like 4 months to actually write all of the code. And then it takes us another 2 months to verify and test these things. And while we're working in these 2 months here, all right, while we're kind of, we've already spent almost half a year on this project. The customer comes back and they want to check up on our work. So we show them what we've built in our design implementation phase, what we're testing, what we're looking at right now. We show it to the customer. The customer immediately says, that's not what I was thinking. All right. We worked a long time. We put a half a year into this project. And because we were working in waterfall and we have to do these large steps bit by bit, we didn't have anything to show to this customer until about 5 or 6 months into the project. And by the time we were able to show it to them, we realized that their vision and our vision are not quite aligned. So what do you have to do in waterfall? You'll notice that all of these arrows are going in one direction. There's no arrow for going back up one level. The only way we deal with having to go back up a level in waterfall is we start the entire process over again. All right, so we begin again. We throw away the code that we started working on. We go back over the requirement specifications. We go back over the system design. We bring in the customer to make sure that they can check it off. We start working on it. And we go through all of these final steps, and we end up going over the initial time. I end up having to pay all of my engineers either overtime, so they stay a lot, like long hours and like just commit to crunch time, which eats up all of my extra capital. And then after 6 months of that, the joy of getting an extra extra, a little bit of extra on the paycheck starts to evaporate because you've just been working, these insane hours for so long. Most of you leave the company, especially the most talented ones, and I'm left in ruins. All right. So what do we want to do? We want to kind of back up quite a bit. And I want to back up all the way back to when I accepted this document from the customer. And I said, yes, I could build that for you. The answer is we can't accept this document. This document does not visualize the scope of the problem in a way that is agreeable to both my team, all of you, and the customer. So first things first, let's start this over and let's get rid of waterfall. We're going to try and build this with a new project management style in mind to fix some of those major problems we were running into. All right. First off, instead of this design document, what I want is a wireframe. I'm going to take the customer and I'm going to have them build a wireframe for me that my team can implement. I might even work with them. This is kind of an aside, but I might even work with them to coach them on building this and getting their idea clarified on paper and asking questions about this and that, and what different features do and and how certain things should behave. And if we decide to work together, I might retroactively bill them for their time. Otherwise, it's on me. If we don't decide to work together, I might retroactively bill them for their time. But if we do, the whole consultation will be on me. Anyway, the idea here is I want a visual layout of the website. I want them to be able to look at pictures of what my team is going to build and check it off, right? Because this customer comes in many shapes and forms, all right? It could be more than just a customer. It could be a boss. It could be another department. Sometimes they're just called product owners or project owners or stakeholders. It's the person who has the idea and wants to see it built. Rarely is it us, the engineering team, who are generating these ideas. It's usually coming from some other part of the company. It's a customer. It's a senior suit type character. Somebody comes along and they want to build a website. All right. So we make them, or I guess I make them as the project manager. I make them build this visual wireframe. All right. And it is important that we get this done before any coding is done by all of you, my software engineers. All right. We first build the wireframe. And once we've gone back and forth on this wireframe and checked it off, and the customer looks at this wireframe or the product owner looks at this wireframe and says, yes, that is what I want to build, then I will take it from them and start working. All right. So now at no point will I start to work on this and surprise the customer with a vision that's different from their own. All right. I want them on the very same page of this. So working pretty much like a belt exam or any of our projects, honestly. We've been working off of wireframes since the beginning of the boot camp, and let me tell you, that is the ideal way to look at one of these projects. Cool. I want to save questions for a little bit later. I want to keep moving forward. So all right, we get a wireframe from the stakeholder, and we're ready to start building. But the stakeholder has a question for us. How long is this going to take? All right. How long is this going to take? And how much is it going to cost? So we can't calculate either of these two things just by looking at the wireframe. So we're going to need to take this wireframe and we're going to need to play with it a little bit to get it to the level that we want. And what we're going to do is we're going to build something called user stories. All right. What a user story is it's a description, a verbal description of a feature of a website. And it always describes it in this way. As a blank, I want blank so that blank. All right. So we identify who we are. So maybe like as a user, I want to click the logout button so that I can end my session. All right. We write it in a way so the user is identified, the person using this. It could be a user, it could be an admin. If you think about like eBay, you have sellers, you have buyers, right? You have admins, you have a lot of different people using the website. We identify who it is that's interacting with it. We identify what their action is, so what they're trying to do. And then we identify what the result of that action is going to be. And it's always written in kind of this first person way, because it's more than just us, the technical team, who needs to read these user stories. We don't actually get to choose which user story is of what importance. All right, we don't order these things, we just describe them. So let's imagine we have a user story, and I'm going to imagine them as these red boxes. All right. A user story is a red box. It has a title of some kind. Usually that's just like a naming convention. So like 10A. Priority we'll talk about, estimate we'll talk about. Acceptance criteria is, this is a little bit different depending on who you're, what kind of team you're working in. But there's usually a description of what you need to do to get this user story actually submitted and completed. There's usually a strong amount of acceptance criteria. So just imagine it like this. You were telling another engineer to build something for you, right? What's written here is the exact requirements for how that feature should be built. Oftentimes, these things are written by more experienced engineers. So when you jump in, you don't necessarily do a lot of thinking on your feet as far as the grand scheme of things. You pull a user story that's described in a way that non-technical people can understand and has acceptance criteria that has been listed by a more senior engineer. All right. And the nice thing is, it's kind of like a to-do list. Honestly, these user stories are probably going to be a million times a million times better documented than the kinds of things that you would see in our learning platform or anything you can imagine. These things are super well documented because there's a lot of different teams that might be influencing these individual user stories, or sometimes we just call them story points. All right. So let's go back to our wireframe real quick and let's kind of consider how many user stories we might have. Because at one point, all of you, the engineers, and myself, and maybe the senior engineers as well, we're all going to get together and we're going to create user stories for each of our features. So hey, remember logout? We have a user story for logout. All right, and everything on the website ends up being a user story. All right, we have a user story for showing the login and registration page. All right, so just showing this page would be a user story. Login would be a user story. Email validation would be a user story. Password and confirm password match would be a user story. Show all would be a user story. These hyperlinks would be a user story. Literally every feature we go through, we rip out everything that the user can interact with, and we write them out as these story points so a non-technical person can understand them, and so any engineer on the team could implement the feature and get a very similar result. All right, so we break it down into all of these user stories, we number them, we rip the whole thing apart this way. And I build up something, let me clear my space. I build up something called the product backlog. All right, a product backlog is basically just a list of user stories. And each of these user stories, like the sum of this product backlog, is basically implementing the entire wireframe. So instead of that big, terrible design document we threw away at the beginning, we took a visual wireframe, we took a visual prototype, we chopped it off into well-described features that anybody on the team could understand, all right? And we put them in a super huge list, all right? And this thing is called our, let me write it down, product backlog, or sometimes just called PBL. So now we have this PBL. Hey, this is a pretty good start. With this PBL, can we go back to the stakeholder and tell them how long this is going to take? Well, no, unfortunately we can't. We still have a little bit more to do. So one thing you're noticing is there's these points here that have these different values. And what we're going to do is all of us, the engineering team is going to, the people who are going to be working on this code, we all get together and we're going to vote democratically together on how difficult we think these user stories are going to be. Typically, how I've seen it done is everybody throws out their votes at the same time, so nobody's influenced by other people's choices. It doesn't like go around in a circle where the seniors get to say what they think first. Everybody just votes at the same time, all right? And that's us. That's the people who are actually going to be working on it. At no point should somebody non-technical come in and tell us how difficult something is going to be. That's for us to decide because we're the technical team. All right, so we get together and we vote on all of the user stories and how difficult they are. Internally at Coding Dojo, I think we use t-shirt sizes. So I think we use extra small, small, medium, large, extra large, and extra, extra large. I've seen other companies and I've worked in teams that use orders of magnitude. So 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64. But rarely do I actually see 1, 2, 3, 4 like we have on this example. Usually they're orders of magnitude larger. And the reason for that is so we can have conversations a lot faster. We don't want to be sitting around arguing whether something's going to be a 7 or a 6, right? That doesn't really make a lot of sense. But if we take one of these particular user stories, any old thing, and we all get together and we vote on its difficulty, and somebody in the back of the room says, oh, that's a 16, easy. And you say, no, that's a 4. That's a very big difference, right? These things roughly equate to hours. So sometimes I think of like a 1 being maybe like a half hour, a 2 being about an hour and a half, a 4 being half of your day, an 8 being your entire day, a 16 being maybe 2 days max, 32 is going to be most of your week, and 64 is a solid week's worth of work. All right, we usually don't have tasks that are like this long as software engineers. Nothing takes a week, right? It usually can be broken down into subtasks. So I would only see something like this in like manufacturing and stuff like that. We have it at the dojo for recording videos because recording videos is notoriously difficult. You have to do a lot of editing. You take a lot of takes. Anyway, the point of having these as orders of magnitude different is so we can have valuable discussions quickly. If I say it's a 16 and you say it's a 4, we can get our feelings out about that real quick. I think it's a 16 because maybe I'm thinking about all of these edge cases that the rest of the team is not worried about. You think it's a 4 because maybe you've done it before. Somebody else thinks it's a 1 because they know a library that does it for us. All right, it's valuable for us to have this discussion and break it down. And it's okay for us to overestimate and underestimate things because at the end of the day, this will all average out. If we're giving it our best shot at the beginning of every project for estimating these story points, we'll have a pretty good idea of how long the team thinks it can get done. Some of these things might take longer, you never know, especially if some of the tasks are things that are not necessarily a feature, but like find this one particular bug, right? Those are story points that could take an extremely long amount of time because you're looking for a bug, you're not implementing a feature, all right? So we get together and we rate on everything and we give everything a story point value. And now we can take the entire product backlog and see how long it takes in story points to complete the backlog, right? To complete all of the features. We're getting closer to estimating an amount of time. Now, somebody else is going to come in and get their hands on this backlog, and those are the stakeholders. And the stakeholders are going to arrange it in priority, where they're going to say like, okay, if we get all of these features, we can launch our minimum viable product. If we get all of these features, that could be like our day one patch, right? If we get all of these features, we can have these released in maybe the first 2 or 3 months after launch. We prioritize them, so the most important stuff to the stakeholders are always at the top. And then the story points are just for estimating how much work there is to be done here. All right. So now that I've done all of that talking and I've talked about backlogs, I think I'm ready to show this image of what an agile project management setup should look like. We've talked about the product owner. This is the stakeholder, right? This is the person who wants to build a website. The team is us. I could be sitting as the Scrum Master. I could be a project manager. It doesn't necessarily matter. I could be a member of the team just as a senior engineer. But we're the engineering team, right? The team. And we don't necessarily come up with the idea of the product. We're not the customer. We're not the manager. We're not the executives. We're just writing their code for them, all right? We help make this into a product backlog, and the product owner prioritizes it so the most important stuff comes up at the top, all right? And then our goal is to break this down into 1 to 4 week long sprints. A sprint is just 1 to 4 weeks worth of work. In software, it's usually 1 week to 2 weeks. And we take off a certain subset of items from the product backlog. So let's say this group of items is kind of important, and then we have another group of items, and then we have another group of items. We get together in what's called a sprint planning meeting, and the team, however many there are, commits to a certain amount of story points for that sprint. So let's say there are 6 of us, and we commit to 40 points each over 2 weeks. All right, so what does that actually equate to? Let's grab our calculator. Let's say there's 6 of us. We can do about 40 story points a week. And let's say the project is about 2,000 story points. So if we can do about 240 as a team in 2 weeks, we can get this done in about 8 weeks. And we can actually start giving estimations back to the product owner on how long this is going to take. All right. Now, how does my team know that they can do 40 story points in a week? And part of that comes down to this sprint planning meeting. And this kind of says it straight up. Team selects, starting at the top, as much as it can commit to deliver by the end of the sprint. I think this is the golden rule of Agile. The team only takes the amount of items off of the backlog that it believes that it can sustainably turn in 2 weeks. That means that you don't take so much work that the whole team gets burned out in 2 weeks. You take exactly how much you think you can do, all right? At first, maybe that's 20 points. Maybe that's 35 points. Maybe that's 40 points. Maybe the company that you work at does points in a different way. So you have to categorize your user stories and the things that you actually submit in different ways. But at the end of the day, everybody commits to a certain amount of user stories, and that becomes our sprint backlog. Now, as a Scrum Master, this is kind of viewing it as a project manager side. We have these burn up and burn down charts. And that's basically just tracking the performance of the team month after month, week after week. So let's say I have people, I could average out their story points and say, okay, Jane, she can turn in 45 average story points. Bill can turn in 38 average story points over a sprint. And then the team has something called a delta. And once you know what the team's delta is, you can find out, how much work they can get done and how many patches they can push periodically. All right. Another part of this is we want to be able to keep adding and making changes in Agile possibly forever. Because when I first introduced this sprint backlog, I kind of introduced it as we're just taking apart a wireframe and putting that into story points. Well, not every story point is the same thing. Some of them could be things like desirements, like new features that we want. Some things could be like increments, like changes to features that we already have. Dependencies, new features that you need to add so later features can be added. Actions, new behaviors for the user to do. New constraints, things that you might be losing, things that might be getting deprecated, things that you now have to worry about. All right. All of these things go into the backlog. If you can imagine what a backlog begins with, at the very top of a backlog is everything you need to make that website like a launchable product. We can actually deploy it. We can get customers. We can get business. At the very bottom of the backlog are things like the nice to have options, new ideas. I like this, intentions, hopes, and dreams. But also things like bugs, right? We could be putting bugs into the backlog. And where a team starts off in maybe the first year, spending most of their time working on functionality and features, they can spend most of the second year working on fixing those features, ironing out bugs, doing all sorts of extra work to it. All right. So let's talk about a sprint for a second. We take something called a sprint backlog. That's the amount of work that the team thinks that they can turn in a week, or 1 to 2 weeks. The sprint end date and the team deliverable does not change. I think this is also kind of a magical thing. Now the team, us, the engineers, have dictated how difficult these items are in the backlog, and we only take what we comfortably think we can turn in within the end date of the sprint. All right. We never should feel forced to take more than we can commit to, because if you do, that makes our burn up and burn down charts inaccurate. Suddenly we have teams that say, oh, we're committing to 60 and now we're only turning in 40. I would just prefer them to commit to 40. And in fact, if they don't think that they can do 40, I would prefer them to commit to less. All right. We want to make sure that the team is committing to what they can do. It's kind of an honesty thing, right? You want to make sure that these engineers are able to work at a sustainable pace. All right. So that comes into our sprint backlog, and the team will work on that for about a week. One tiny part of that is we also have a 24-hour sprint, and that 24-hour sprint just includes a daily stand-up meeting. The team gets together once a day and talks about everything that they're going to do. Usually you talk about what you did yesterday, and you talk about what you're going to do today, and you talk about any challenges you're facing. And usually there's somebody like a scrum master or a project manager there. So if there's something holding you back that you can't fix, like, oh, I don't have a password to XYZ, you pass it on to them in that daily stand-up meeting. All right. But there's a daily stand-up meeting is really, really important. And part of you reporting what you did yesterday and what you're planning on doing today is not for the rest of the team to hear, but mostly so you can say it out loud, right? It's kind of a psychological thing. You just say what you're going to do that day in the morning, every day, out loud to the team. All right. And we go through that sprint and we go through these 24-hour sprints and we go through and we go through, and then the sprint finally ends. And we have two ceremonial meetings. First, the sprint review. Sprint review is we show off everything that we made, we submit it, everything looks good, we pat ourselves on the back. Actually, wait, sprint review has no back patting. We show off our work, we talk about everything that we submitted. I think maybe the product owner is happy about what they've seen. And then we have this thing called the sprint retrospective. And that's where all the back patting happens. And we all talk about all the good work we did. We talk about what we could do to be better for the next sprint. We talk about, challenges and other things that came up during our sprint. And then we start it all over again. We go back to the backlog. We pull another sprint's worth of tasks. We work on it for 1 to 4 weeks. We have daily stand-ups. We review it at the end of the sprint. We have a retrospective. We go back to the backlog. It is somebody else's job to keep the backlog filled with tasks. It is somebody's job, ideally, to make sure that the team isn't overcommitting or undercommitting onto the sprint backlog. Mostly what we do is we have a really big to-do list of a lot of really well-described to-dos, and our job is to pull them off of the top and commit to what we know we can do in a week, because the only way our boss can accurately predict how long software will take to, how long it's going to take to build things is if we're all honest about how much we can do in a 1 to 2 to 3 week span. All right. Other thing about this, end date and deliverable does not change. When a sprint starts, the backlog is locked in and the end date is locked in. At no point can some executive manager type come busting into the engineering team and demand everybody stop what they're doing right now because they're going to work on something else. That always happens after the sprint retrospective. Right? If you're getting moved to a different team, if you're jumping into a brand new project, you'll figure that out at the next sprint planning meeting, not in the middle of a sprint. Ideally, and that is like kind of one of the key things too, is you don't disrupt the engineering team after they started. Now, if you notice, there's very little exposure to the outside world in a good agile team. The team kind of minds their own business. They focus on the product backlog. They focus on delivering their sprints. You shouldn't have a lot of micromanagement. There shouldn't be executive types, manager types, customers standing over you, telling you what to do. All of that is expressed through the backlog already. And there are people in other roles who are working with the customers and the stakeholders to make sure that backlog is all clean and the way it should be. Now, as far as finished work goes, we don't get to take credit for things that are not 100% complete. And sometimes that's why these user stories have an acceptance criteria. Anything less than these acceptance criteria means you get 0, you get nothing, which is kind of a bummer. But it also means that in an ideal situation, one individual engineer on the team will kind of fluctuate in how many user stories that they submit over a sprint by sprint basis. Sometimes you submitted 25 points. The next sprint you submitted 60 points because you had some unfinished work that still needed to be completed that rolled over. There's a lot of talk about not picking out somebody who consistently does the least amount and arbitrarily firing them, because oftentimes that person is the person that's doing the most pair programming and giving the most support. And that's often killed a lot of engineering teams. So usually you get those 6, 7, 8 people together and you just put them on sprints forever. And I know that seems a little scary, like forever, but that's how agile project management is designed. It's designed so people could work sustainably on these teams without going insane, without dying, without getting overworked forever. And you better believe that there are agile project management teams that are constantly working on banking software and security software and websites and e-commerce. And I think especially if there's any gamers listening, you saw this in uh, the early access community. Is the early access is basically selling a product backlog. This is everything that we want to do. We know that we can't finish it yet, but we're gonna sell what we have, our MVP, and we're gonna show you what our backlog looks like, and then gradually add in features over the next, year or so, right? I'm sure a lot of gamers have been exposed to that kind of marketing strategy before. I think that's how Minecraft got started. Minecraft first got started, it was very, very simple. And they're like, okay, it's going to take us longer, but if you pay us now, we'll keep working on it. What kind of team is that? I see an agile project management team, right? I see people who are steadily, regularly pushing mergeable code and improved code, right? And that's why Facebook and all your favorite social media and all your favorite websites steadily change every week, every month, and nothing except for Wikipedia and Craigslist is really that static. Um, Now, funny, Javier's like, well, what about Cyberpunk 2077? Like I said before, you can't really plan for bug fixes. It's hard to time cap something like that. A new feature you can time cap, but fixing a feature that's broken is very difficult to time cap. So I do have sympathy for people who are in an environment like this, but working mostly on bug fixes rather than new implemented code. And that goes for websites as well. I mean, there are people out there who are still working on Facebook and they're still working on eBay. And you might be asking, well, what are they doing? What do Facebook engineers do? Facebook is done. It already gives me a bunch of ads. I already don't like it. Well, what they do is they work in agile teams and they work off of a backlog. And I promise you that backlog is filled with bugs and weird behavior. Um, so something else that I wanted to touch on is I wanted to show a Kanban board just because I think a lot of people think about this when they think about project management. Like, I think everybody's seen this, right? Whether you've watched Silicon Valley or you've just toured somebody's offices, or you've just seen some like weird clip art, weird corporate clip art that kind of looks like a project management board. But what Kanban is, and there's a couple other styles for this as well, this is for handling, where are we? A single sprint, right? So imagine for a second, this left board of story points, this is the sprint backlog, right? We have the sprint backlog over here and all of these different user stories. We have everything that people are working on. We have the progress, an in progress column, we have a testing column, and we have a done column. Generally at the start of the sprint, all of the post-it notes are all the way on the left-hand side. At the end of the sprint, all or most of the post-it notes are all the way on the done column. But if you just look at Kanban, there's like a million implementations of it with different structures and different ways to break it down. There's online tools like Trello boards that are very, very similar, but let you set up any number of columns with any number of categories. But generally, it's just these things. It's a sprint backlog, it's everything that's currently in progress, and then it's a done column. And post-it notes kind of flood over from the left over onto the right over the course of the week. This is more for managing your sprint than it is for managing the entire project. You don't build code from scratch with post-it notes on a whiteboard, but you do keep track of everything that you've been working on, over the last week with post-it notes on a whiteboard, especially if you have like 6 engineers working on it. How I look at our assignment progress sheet. Yeah, I mean, very, very similar in a way. All right. Um, and I think actually, hey, this is a pretty good one. I think this breaks down the different the different kind of containers of a project. You have that master backlog, and that's the to-do list that encompasses all of the features. You have a sprint backlog, and that encompasses everything that maybe the 6 engineers on the team agreed to do for 2 weeks. You have a to-do list, which is just everything that we're actively breaking down. Maybe some of these user stories have subtasks, like login and registration to me is one large task that has a bunch of subtasks. You build the models, you do validation, you get like an email validation in there, and then login as well as registration. It ends up being like a whole set of tasks. So we break them all down. We keep track of what's being worked on by who at what point in the week. Towards the end of the week or towards the end of the sprint, you start verifying your story points, making sure that they pass those minimum requirements, and then you move them into the done column. Once your code has been, checked off by a more senior engineer, you usually send a pull request for the Git repo. They'll look over your code and then they'll merge it in. And then the rest of the code handling will be passed off to DevOps for worrying about public branches and stuff like that. Usually your last task in something like this is sending that pull request. Your code gets taken and gets added back into the main pile. In my mind, though, the most reassuring part of agile project management is that we don't need to spend a lot of time worrying about this product backlog, especially as junior level engineers. You would be lucky to be involved in a meeting where people are voting on the difficulty of the backlog of the user stories. Like that would be really, really cool. I would imagine that that probably goes to people who are a little bit more senior than you. But it's very unlikely you'll be sorting this, you'll be touching it, you'll be writing in the features, you'll be listing out the requirements. Mostly what we do is we just pull off items off of the top. We pull out something that's extremely well described. It's written both so an engineer can understand it and so a non-developer can understand it depending on what the company is, and you work on it for those 2 weeks. All right. Now, another thing that comes up a lot is what is Scrum? Or actually, what is Agile? So I want to look at this thing called the Agile Project Manifesto real quick. And if you actually Google search Agile Project Management, you'll see something that looks a lot like the kind of graph that we looked at. There's maybe a dozen that end up being very similar. But you should also see this kind of big list of do's and don'ts. Agile Manifesto. Yeah, so I want this one. I really like this thing. So everything that I've explained over the last 40 minutes, everything I've explained is not actually agile. It's the implementation of these 12 points, all right? There were some things that might not have made sense. There are some goals that we might not have realized that we were kind of going for. But when it comes down to it, we were trying to see these 12 things happen to separate us from maybe waterfall project management. And number one is straight up continuous delivery of software. All right, we want to be able to deliver it before it's complete, and we want to be able to keep delivering new features week after week. And that's kind of the goal. I think of banking software. I think of things that are never going to be going away that need constant maintenance. You need engineers working on that software, continuously. We want to welcome changing requirements. If you notice, the sprint itself is the only thing that's on a cycle. So if somebody goes through and like completely rearranges the product backlog between 2 sprints, that's fine, right? We welcome that. Somebody could come along and say, you know what, I want all of the bug requirements at the very top, all of these bugs at the very top of our sprint backlog. And we welcome those things. We never completely reset like we did back in waterfall. It's kind of like shorter, tighter loops. Delivering working software frequently, couple of months, couple of weeks, preferably on a shorter time scale. I mean, this comes down to the idea that we're always only merging workable code. Nobody gets to merge unfinished code. And the code that gets merged is also code that follows user stories that have been well described by senior engineers. So we're constantly delivering working code this way. We never want to break the entire project. If we break the entire project, we just won't push that week, right? Oh, I'm waiting for a patch. Patch never came. Well, that's because the patch broke everything. Business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. That stand-up meeting, that daily stand-up meeting, typically involves some non-technical people there, especially people who can help you with things that the engineering team can't solve. Different kind of business asks, just requirements, passwords sometimes. But this is kind of realized in the daily stand-up. Build around motivated individuals, give them the environment and the support they need, and trust them to get the job done. You'll notice that this is very hands-off. You don't have a project manager that hangs over you and watches you code. And some of these project managers, in fact, many of them are non-technical. They're just paying attention to this product backlog, and they're getting yelled at by kind of, business types to get the code built. A good project manager is a buffer between the rest of the company and the engineering team, right? And you kind of let the engineering team just do their job. You want to trust them to do their job because they're the experts, right? In this case, we're the experts, we're the technical people. We know how to solve these problems. We speak the right words and we know all of the ancient runes, so we get to do it. Anyway, we want to promote sustainable development. Sponsors, developers, users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. This kind of goes down to you don't lie about how much you deliver in 2 weeks. You're never forced to deliver more than you can. Nobody should ever come along and say, you need to do 55 story points this week or you're fired. That is counter to everything that agile is. The idea that we're building in this way is so that you can keep building into that way forever. What if your job was to maintain the software that runs in maybe the International Space Station to keep it in orbit? I would imagine that you would want to be pushing changes every 2 weeks. Not scary changes, but like you're paying attention to that code. You're not just letting it spin indefinitely. All right. This kind of accounts for the kinds of software that does need constant maintenance. And for me, that's security, network stuff, banking, and soon stuff, in orbit as well. Cool. Working software is the primary measurement of progress. If you notice, there was nowhere in this entire example that you get credit for half completed features. It's all or nothing. You either get the story point completed and merged or you didn't. Unless it's merged, you didn't get the feature, you'll have to do it next sprint. The most efficient and effective method for conveying information within a development team is face-to-face conversation, or Zoom, I guess. I think number 8 is kind of highlighted by email is terrible. I mean, at the end of the day, email is one of the worst ways to get things done. And even chat, things like Discord, Slack, none of that is as good as daily meetings. Daily in-person meetings on Zoom, on a group chat, preferably something where you can look people in the eyes, or even an on-site meeting when, knock on wood, we're no longer in COVID times. But these things are important. We have to have daily personable meetings. And that is the best way to pass information around. Number 9, continuous attention to technical excellence, blah, 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 blah. I mean, I feel like this one is emphasized by that sprint retrospective. There is on the schedule every 2 weeks a meeting focused on everybody looking back on what they did and talking about what they can do better. Like that is a meeting for you, the technical team, to reflect because that's a pretty big deal. I mean, there's not a lot on the agile schedule. We have about 4 or 5 total meetings that we have to consider. And one of them is just focused on everybody patting themselves on the back and talking about what they can do to be a better team. Um, and I think that's important. Uh, Number 10, I live by this one. Maximize the amount of work not done. You'll notice in the previous example with waterfall, we had to throw away code. The goal is that if you are paying software engineers maybe 6-figure salaries, you do not have them write code that you cannot use, ever, ideally. You want them writing code that you can use. So in order to do that, that product backlog needs to be well maintained with doable work at the top every single time. So that's up to the rest of the company to make sure that the engineering team can stay productive. But nobody should be writing code that's useless. And if you can maximize the amount of work not done, it's a beautiful thing. The best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. Again, you'll notice that at no point was there a project manager saying, you do this story point, you do this story point, you do this story point, you do this story point. Everybody kind of volunteers themselves, right? You go through and you pull off of the pile with everybody else on the team. And it's up to the team to organize. Maybe you have somebody who's really good at CSS. And while it's good that they do CSS for maybe the most time sensitive projects, if it's not time sensitive, maybe somebody else should do the CSS so they could get a little bit better and a little bit more agile. All right. You want to allow the team to make these decisions. There's ideally not a micromanager standing over your desk telling you what thing to do at what step. All of those instructions come from the user stories themselves. And then finally, 12 and 9 are very similar in my book. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more agile, how to adjust their behavior, how to be a little bit better. That could be just, hey, I'm really bad at XYZ. Don't give me XYZ when it's very time sensitive. That could be just people sharing experiences. Oh, hey, I had to do a lot of research to deal with that one story point, and I figured out all of these things. I want to share them with the group. There should be a sense of growth. I mean, a good software engineering team, everybody is trying to kind of grow their skills and get a little bit better as they work because nobody knows it all, right? Software engineering is complicated, computer science is complicated, and if we have 6 people working on 6 different things, it's very likely that in a month's worth of time, those 6 people will not have learned the same things. And it's good for them to share that information with one another, and everybody kind of advances a little bit more rapidly. Um, Cool. Hey, you know what? That's agile project management. I feel like the big thing I want to stress here is working on in a large company on a large team shouldn't feel too different from what you've already been exposed to. You were given a wireframe. That wireframe is reduced down into instructions. You have to do those instructions within a certain time cap. Generally, you're given actually a lot more time in a real company to do things than you are here at Coding Dojo. But at the same hand, you could have 2 weeks to do a particular user story that you pulled off of the pile and realize that you need to learn something new to actually submit those at the end of those 2 weeks. Being able to learn new technologies, being flexible, being a well-rounded full stack engineer makes this whole team more valuable. And that's why for especially agile teams, they're often looking for full stack engineers, trying to get not just people who specialize in front end or back end, but people who specialize in really anything, any task you can imagine. And then even if you end up at PayPal and get a great job, you could end up working on a lot of backlog tasks that are just little tiny CSS bugs. Cool. Hey, I want to go ahead and answer some questions. So if people have questions about these topics, about other things in project management, about other things in the industry that I might be able to answer, now is the time.
Question.
Sure, what's up?
Um, so are can user stories also be like kind of like modularized in a way, like how we like modularize our assignments? Are we able to like kind of like have pre-layouts of like our like like type up our own little boilerplates for user stories?
I mean, it could be that some stuff is reused, uh, but I mean, so like some stuff is like going to be really common. So like
Yeah, like the CRUD
email
stuff.
validation is always going
Mhm.
to be email validation no matter what. Um, but I would say probably not. Um,
Okay.
one thing that is common is user stories have sub stories as well. So like one large task could be broken up into many smaller tasks.
Okay.
Cool. Other questions?
I have another question.
Sure.
So when it comes to like the sprints, like how you were talking about how like like they're doing all that and everything, does the sprint also include like planning, or is it just when they're only straight coding?
It's just coding because
Okay.
technically all of that planning went into the product backlog. The
Okay.
people who decided what the app is, how that app is going to be profitable and benefit the company, how it's broken down into small tasks, how the stories are written, and the requirements of the stories are all probably going to be handled in the backlog for before we touch anything. What we'll be interested in is the backlog items that are kind of pushed towards the top, those most important things. And it will be extremely unlikely that we will be adding anything ourselves to the product backlog, especially if it's a large company.
Okay. And then what was the 24-hour sprint again?
So every day you just work. So it's just like your daily sprint, right? So like you go in and you work for 6 hours or 8 hours or maybe a little bit longer. But part of that 24-hour sprint is you have a daily stand up. Every single day you meet as a group with the team, ideally face to face or on Zoom or something, and just check in. What are you working on today? What are you working on tomorrow?
Mhm. And also like how you were talking about like the companies like deadlines and stuff. So like
Mm.
it's not like they want you to fix something within a day, like you said.
It's
So
very
like
unlikely.
things.
Now, well, here's the thing. It really depends. Now, if you had like a core software engineering team, it's very unlikely that they will get disrupted, like on off of a sprint to immediately work on something else. Now, if the company is large enough and they have enough customers and they have enough requirements for it, there could be a dedicated team who are like the drop everything people and immediately fix a problem. And sometimes that's actually DevOps or the deployment people who have that job. So if you work in DevOps, sometimes the server goes down in the middle of the night and you need to figure out why the server went down. And it's not about sprints at this point because you can't get any customers. For the core software engineering team, however, they should never get disrupted that way. If there are those kinds of disruptions, a large company will have people set up for it.
Oh, okay. Okay. And then this one is just kind of like a extra question. Do companies have like morale boosting events, or is it just pretty much everybody just
Oh,
to
absolutely.
talk in their own cubicle? Oh, okay.
I mean a lot of those things are in my opinion totally insufferable. Like some corporate patriotism event where everybody gets together and feels really glad that they work for XYZ company. I'm a
Oh,
pretty big believer in separation of uh, uh, life and work life balance. And like
mm-hmm.
part of that work life balance is being able to have weekends and being able to walk away from the job and not feel connected to it 24/7. And I feel like agile does promote that. because
Oh,
the
okay.
ideal situation is you have these engineers that work in this team for the future, and you don't have to go hunting for new engineering talent. You have these engineers that know your application and they know your source code, and they can do a lot of things efficiently, and bringing on somebody is going to be expensive, and they got to get trained.
Mhm.
um, Something else that sometimes occurs with this is the different types of launches. So there's an Olympic style launch, and that means if it's not done by the time it's launched, it's just not going in. So like video games are Olympic style launches. They have a release date, and if that feature isn't in the game by release date, well, it's going to come into a patch later or just never show up. All right. Those are kind of like Olympic style launches. Another launch is more like a space shuttle, where you will delay launch as much as you can, even on the day, if it's not 100% perfect, right? There's no reason to set risk for it. There's no reason to press the on button until everything's dialed in. And those are sometimes kind of like the space shuttle launches.
Okay.
So here's a question. What would you have to do to really mess up? Like the possibility of getting fired in the workspace? Are companies usually a one and done, or developers get a lot of chances? So, I mean, I've had heard stories of people not lasting longer than a sprint. There's a story that goes around really commonly at the dojo of somebody who got a role, and he wasn't able to get the app working on his computer to do his story points, and he was quiet about it for 2 weeks, and when his boss found out, he was like, "Okay, you're fired." He's like, "You were quiet about that for 2 weeks? You should have said something in, like, the first 2 hours instead of waited and waited until it got this long." And then they just let him go, like, immediately. Um,
Oh,
so
like a job
so
at Google or Microsoft, I think.
Yeah. So in my book, what would you have to do to really mess up is being quiet, not being proactive, not putting yourself out there. Um, but it's very unlikely that you could like make a git mistake and get fired over it. I talked with somebody who worked at Riot, who makes League of Legends, and he accidentally brought down their production server twice. He thought he was looking at a staging server, and he rebooted it. And he's like, "Well, that's weird. That didn't do anything." And then he rebooted it again and realized that he had the controls for the production server open, and he was looking at the staging server, which means that he booted off like, I don't know, it was like 700,000 people playing League of Legends or something ridiculous like that. Um, and he kept screenshots of it, and he printed them out and he framed them. So he didn't get fired for that mistake. But I have heard people doing like dramatic mistakes that might lead to it, depending if you lose the company a lot of money. Um, what's more likely, and I think what's most common, is when people first join a company, they have a hard time finishing some of their first story points. They have a hard time getting to the point where their code is actually merged into the code base. And if you are consistently behind, like only doing 10, 15, like a small amount of work in a 2 week period consistently for month after month, you could get yourself let go. But usually, if you're really putting your all into it, and people understand that new code bases are kind of take a while to get used to, um, uh, you can keep going forward. It shouldn't uh, come up as a problem. Um, your hired company basically teaches you everything you need to know. That's what I've heard from my developer friends. I mean, the hired company teaches you a lot. But at the end of the day, what makes you capable of picking up that stuff is that you can learn quickly, you're a full stack developer, and you've picked up new technologies very quickly before. So in cases like that, the company will teach you a lot of their software, and a lot of the things, the majority of your job, you're going to need to learn on site. The ability to pick that up quickly is learned in situations like what we're in right now. Just picking up something new quickly just for the exercise of picking up something new, not because your boss asked you to. So yeah, most of what you'll be learning on the job, but picking up new things in your free time and picking up new technologies makes that whole process easier and more survivable. What does career progression look like? I've seen a lot of people start off as like engineer level one, and then there's usually a direction to like a higher level engineer where you spend a little bit more time writing these features and getting into maybe a solutions department where you spend more time kind of directing junior level engineers. And then there's even becoming an engineering lead where you have people working under you. That's actually what my father did for many years. He was a software engineer like in his 30s, but as he kind of progressed in his career, he was almost predominantly working as a manager, as a technical manager with a lot of people reporting to him. So there's that as well. I mean, if you're interested in having reports, me personally, I prefer to not have anybody reporting to me. I'd rather just report to one person and that's it. If I can have any situation, I'd love to work with nothing but peers. That's kind of my ideal. Let's see. You need to be proactive in your team about trying new things. So hey, to answer that question, Spencer, I've actually heard that Google specifically wants you to be spending half of your time working on new things and half of your time doing work for your team. There are companies out there that expect you to be doing new things on your free time. If you worked for maybe Adobe or Microsoft or an older, more established company or IBM, that's probably a little bit less likely than, hip, fun Google, hip, fun, kind of evil Google. Uh, Entry level roles demanding for you to know everything. No, but entry level roles are demanding that you be coachable and work well in a group. So you need to be able to take advice. You need to be able to take criticism. You need to be able to pick up what somebody's trying to share with you really quickly. It's that coachability is kind of one of the most important things. The beautiful thing in all of this is engineers are well taken care of because again, we're the ones who actually wield all of the magic, right? If you look at the internet and everything that the internet does, it's standing on the shoulders of software engineers. And a lot of people's first role as a software engineer are implementing features that more senior engineers have thoroughly described. So beautiful thing is we follow wireframes for most of our career. It's going to take us a while until we're building our own wireframes, except for this quick moment when you're a job seeker and you have to do everything. Final thing I'll just share is there are a million books written about agile project management, about Scrum, about the Agile Manifesto. There are YouTube videos, there are online tutorials, there are Udemy courses. You can always reach out and brush up on this a little bit better. Get a better understanding of who the Scrum Master is, what the product owner is, what these sprint planning meetings actually act like. Most of my background in Agile, I watched these series of skits that they put on with clip art. And there was like one dude who was dressed up as a construction worker who just asked dumb questions. And his dumb questions, I feel like taught me like 70% of what I know about Agile. Somebody's like, well, what does the project manager do at this point? And then somebody answers him and I'm like, oh, that's a good point. So there are resources out there and I recommend reaching out to it. But having a little bit of a background in this helps. And you can easily take a weekend course and become Scrum or Agile certified as just a little bit of extra icing on the cake for your resume. What project would you say is necessary to have in our portfolio to start with? I think you need 3 things in your portfolio. This is unrelated to Agile, but you need 3 things. You need one beautiful CSS project. You need one project that immediately gets people's attention when the page loads. It could overlap with the CSS project, but I feel like it's something that has an animation or some loading screens or some dynamic data, something that immediately starts with interesting stuff. And then the final one should be something with a complicated database, like a big complex movie rental service, an inventory management system. It doesn't need to be pretty, but a complicated database helps. I think those three things, something pretty with CSS, something eye-catching, preferably with JavaScript, and then something with a complex database, preferably with MySQL. And then a question about wireframing tools. I use balsamic mockups. Yeah, balsamic mockups. I realize if you are not able to just guess this spelling, but I use balsamic mockups. I'm a big fan of it. This is the thing that we use inside Coding Dojo. How are there no screenshots of balsamic? Yeah, and it looks pretty much like the wireframe. It gives you all of these different things that you can kind of pull into, and it just lets you make little black and white wireframes. I recommend it. Sometimes what I recommend for new projects is you build your wireframe in something like Balsamic, you build a clickable prototype, you link to the GitHub, and then you don't need to finish the rest of the features. You have a working example of what you wanted to do. So hey, take advantage of this kind of stuff. I highly recommend. And also note that no engineer in any industry is just building a website like blindly. They have a goal. There's always a wireframe or a backlog, or in the very worst scenario, maybe some big, terrible project document, but there is something that they're following. I don't write code blindly. Like I just don't write code into the ether. I have a goal in mind. I never write any code without something that I'm trying to do. And I think that goes the same for writing new projects. I start with the goal, and once I have the goal, I'm ready to start working. Anyway, it is 3:12. If there are any other questions, say them now. But I think I'm starting to lose my voice, so I think I want to break this one. Questions have slowed down. Cool. Hey, that's all I wanted to share. For anybody who's feeling a little nervous about the future, about what the industry holds for you, if you are coding off of a wireframe, you are doing something that is furthering you in your career, period, hands down. And what I described here is also the best case. There are a lot of kind of non fully realized implementations of agile where it is not so nice for the developer. But in the ideal situation, agile is good for us. We benefit from it. It keeps our jobs more simple, more relaxed, more straightforward, less stress, because the idea is to keep us around possibly forever. And it would be nice to have that kind of job security. Forever is the kind of job security that I'm down for, personally. Anyway, that's all I got. Let's go ahead and meet for algos tomorrow morning. And if anybody else has any other questions or comments, you can find me here in Zoom or in Discord. I will see you around.
Thank you, Brendan.